Hi, my name is Joe Smith. I'm the Director of the Royal Geographical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second in our series of Earth Stories. These are short pieces of content that allow a leading global expert to share their current take on environment and sustainability themes. We want them both to be of general public interest, and they will be, but also to support people who are trying to tell stories about environment and sustainability in the media or cultural institutions and help to inform their planning for the future. So today we've asked Amanda Vincent, who is a research scholar and practical frontline conservationist, to talk to her work. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, that is the country's top academic accolade, and is the 2021 winner of the Indianapolis Prize. That is the world's top award for animal conservation, and it's never before been given to an ocean advocate. Amanda is full professor in the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia, UBC, in Canada. In 2020, she was named a Pew Fellow in Marine Conservation, the world's preeminent award in her field. Back in '96, she co-founded and still directs Project Seahorse, an interdisciplinary and international team committed to conservation and sustainable use of the world's coastal marine ecosystems. Now, I'm going to let Amanda speak for herself, but do look up Project Seahorse. It's a real model for engaged scholarship, for having a practical impact as an academic and working in a collaborative way with all of the relevant other people. So please welcome Amanda to our digital stage.
Hello, so glad to be here. You've probably heard of plastics and their impacts on marine life, and you will have heard of climate change and how it affects the ocean. But in fact, fisheries are by far the larger and more immediate threat for marine life and food security, much bigger and more proximate than either plastics or climate change. So let me explain. I'm going to talk particularly about a form of fishing called bottom trawling. This involves dropping heavily weighted nets onto the ocean floor and towing them for kilometers, dragging up all marine life along the way and flattening the ocean bottom. It's huge, it's devastating, and something has to be done about it. So let's cut to the chase and tell you that the solution is for us to end bottom trawling. We're not trying to end fishing, just bottom trawling. We've got to reconcile fisheries with conservation of the ocean, and bottom trawling is a total impediment to progress on this. Well, what is bottom trawling? Let me tell you and take you there. So I want you to imagine your favorite forest or your woodland, somewhere truly beautiful and full of life. Now I'd like you to close your eyes. And with your eyes closed, I want you to imagine two gigantic helicopters dropping a heavily weighted razor wire to the floor of this forest and towing a massive net behind that weighted wire. And that as they progress, they're going to shear off every tree, every bush, every flower and blade of grass. And along the way, they're going to collect all the bees, the birds, the butterflies, all the bugs, the beavers, the bears, all of them. And at the end of this long tow, they're going to take all that amazing forest life and they're going to sell it for chicken feed or food for aquaculture, for fish. They've left devastation in their wake. There's nothing. It's an empty, scoured landscape now. Now, I want you to tell me how long we would allow that to happen. How much of that would we tolerate before there was a massive hue and cry? And yet, that's what we're doing in the ocean all the time. So I'd like you to open your eyes and go from this beautiful scene to this beautiful scene, which is in the ocean. And this is a kelp forest, a habitat where you might get bottom trawling. Bottom trawling is just what I described to you on land, but happening out of sight in the ocean. So you're dragging over seagrasses or sponges or soft bottom habitats, and you're flattening them and removing everything. This is what a bottom trawl looks like. You're actually got weighted chains on the bottom and heavy, heavy metal plates called doors, which holds the net open. Now these trawls, this one's very small. These trawls can be 45 stories wide. Think of that, tip a building on its side, 45 stories high. They can tow for up to 5 hours, let's say, covering maybe 30 to 40 kilometers. About half of the Mediterranean has been directly towed. About 80% of the Adriatic has been directly towed, doing terrible, terrible damage. It's extraordinary, the scale of this operation. So let me explain. Hundreds of thousands of bottom trawlers operate all over the world. Hundreds of thousands are active. It became really prevalent after World War II, when this form of fishing was introduced in many areas, often by development agencies, in a bid to make fishing more efficient. And that it did. It took far more marine life out of the ocean with far less effort, but that is a hiding to nothing. About a quarter of global marine catches now come from bottom trawling. Maybe half of everything caught in Asia comes from bottom trawling. And bottom trawling covers over 80% of the seabed in some regions. Of course, repeatedly, over and over again, trawled again and again. And in case you want to know more, I've put down our URL for our website where you can find all the references for everything I'm going to say in this talk. I'm trying to find a way of how I can convey the scale of the operation and its implications. So let me go to my first area of expertise, which is seahorse conservation. Now, most bottom trawlers only catch 1 to 2 seahorses per boat per night. Not a lot, you say, almost invisible and unnoticeable. And yet we've discovered in just the first 21 countries that we surveyed with field studies, the total catch was over 11 million seahorses annually. Just think about how much trawl effort that represents. How many times were those nets dragged over the ocean bottom? And then realize that these are some of the species that are not caught particularly heavily at 1 to 2 per night. And imagine the ecosystem damage inflicted on the other species in the net and the habitats. So I'm going to summarize this in a 1-minute video. It is appalling how bottom trawl fishing is destroying our seas. All over the world, bottom trawlers are clear-cutting our ocean floor and dragging up most marine life along the way. Boats drop wide-mouthed nets with heavy weights that gouge and scrape, mowing down seagrasses and corals. These nets catch thousands of species, from seahorses to sharks, including many juvenile fish that should grow into valuable human food. The waste of life is atrocious, and the cost is dreadful. Landed catch is now often sold unsorted for mere pennies as feed for farmed fish or other animals. Bottom trawling is unprofitable and only continues because our governments give them our money to keep them fishing. It gets worse. Some trawlers even rely on crews of slaves or other forced labor. Bottom trawling is annihilation fishing. It needs to stop. And indeed, it does need to stop. It needs to stop for all those reasons, and also because bottom trawling is incompatible with international commitments. So the United Nations has developed something called Sustainable Development Goals, which are a collection of 17 goals designed to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. And these were set up in 2015 by the United Nations General Assembly and are intended to be achieved by the year 2030. Now, they're criticized often for their inability to protect biodiversity. And indeed, you can see the problem here. If we look at Sustainable Development Goal 14, called Life Below the Water, it states that the goal is to conserve and sustainably use the world's oceans, seas, and marine resources. And as part of that, there are targets, including one that says we need to regulate harvesting or exploitation such that we end overfishing and unregulated fishing and destructive fishing practices and actually get to science-based management for recovery. And bottom trawling flies completely in the face of that commitment to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal. We're not getting close to ending overfishing or destructive fishing or actually dealing with a lot of the illegality, as I'll explain. So I want to parse out a little bit more of what we showed you in that 1-minute video. So let's talk about the ecological disaster. So In bottom trawling, we catch everything that we encounter. And our team is in the middle of documenting the number of species in bottom trawls, and we're finding thousands of fish species alone. But on top of that, there are, of course, crustaceans and mollusks and echinoderms and all the other invertebrates. And of course, other vertebrates like marine turtles. So tropical bottom trawlers in Asia catch maybe 800 species just in that set of bottom trawls. I suspect that's an underestimate. Along the way, we're mowing down seagrasses, corals, sponges, digging into estuarine habitats, leveling off contours so that what was a very interesting bottom with lots of habitat species is now flattened as devastation. We disturb the sediment. And what's really scary is we're actually worsening climate change because all the carbon that was sequestered in the bottom of the ocean is now being released. Now, marine sediments have the largest pool of carbon storage in the world. So when the bottom trawling digs up and releases the carbon from the seabed sediment, we're really deleteriously affecting climate change and actually increasing ocean acidification at the same time. So in ecological terms, this is a mess, but it's also economically very problematic. And this to me is one of the nubs of the matter. This is crazy practice. So bottom trawling removes tons of food species that should actually be used to feed people and instead are bycatch, unintended capture. And they're sold commonly, as we mentioned, for chicken feed or animal feed. And in this assemblage of stuff you didn't mean to catch, this indiscriminate catch, are a huge number of juveniles of species that would grow up to be good human food if we let them be. I'm further infuriated by the fact that much of this indiscriminate catch is actually sold for mere pennies a kilogram. And of course, fisheries are not making money when they sell their catch at that sort of rate. So a huge proportion of bottom trawl fisheries actually lose money. The compensation comes in the form of government subsidies. That's public money being paid to trawl boats so that they can keep fishing and losing money. And that's often in the form of making cheaper fuel or fuel subsidies. On top of that, we have a social horror that we should be very concerned about. So bottom trawlers are depleting ocean resources at a really unacceptable rate, and that creates a high cost for small-scale fisheries, targeted fisheries, more select fisheries, which are much more sustainable. It also creates conflict with those small-scale or artisanal fishers who would be using traps or pots or nets that are in great danger from bottom trawls going through and are commonly very severely damaged. But there's much worse as well. So trawl fishers in some parts of the world, and most notably and best documented in Thailand, actually rely on crews of slaves or other forced labor, commonly migrant workers who've been caught up in debt that they can never repay. We also have many other instances of trafficking or of indentured labor or other labor violations on vessels, and also on shore, for example, where women are in shrimp peeling sheds processing some of the catch from the bottom trawlers. And as if this weren't all enough, the story is actually worsening. So I think I'm just stunned by the horror of realizing that many of these bottom trawlers go to sea with no target at all. They're now just going out to catch life. They're going out to catch carbon and extract it from the ocean. So there's no attempt to reduce bycatch. That the bycatch has itself become the focus of the fishing enterprise. And that bycatch, caught completely indiscriminately, is brought to shore where a worm is worth as much as a shark if they're going to all be reduced just to marine protein for the animal feed, for example. So once you reach that point of non-selective fishing, where the goal is life itself, then you've really reached a point of annihilation where a great many normal fisheries management tools no longer apply. You're not going to have catch quotas. You're not going to have all sorts of biological reference points. Instead, you're just going to have extraction, annihilation, pure and simple. This in itself is a problem in light of other negotiations that are currently underway, particularly for the Convention on Biological Diversity and its global biodiversity framework. We've just exhausted 10 years of Aichi targets under this convention, which were biodiversity targets, and are now setting up a new framework. This is intended to guide us till 2050 with some punctuation marks at 2030. And you can see that the mission until 2030 is to take urgent action to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity, to look at fair and equitable sharing, and to make certain we're moving towards recovery. Now, these global biodiversity targets will guide all other United Nations operations that bear on biodiversity. So they're very important, and they're being negotiated right now as I speak. One of those is a general hand-waving one to ensure that harvesting, trade, and use of wild species is sustainable, legal, and safe. Now, let's remember that fish are wildlife, that marine invertebrates are wildlife. We're talking about wildlife and its extraction when we talk about this bottom trawling. And this target is meant to cover forestry and hunting and all the rest, but it certainly is meant to cover fisheries. So now is a good time for us to kick up a stink and object thoroughly to the devastation caused by bottom trawling and how inherently it undermines this target 5. So what are the solutions that we can advance? Well, one of them is obviously just to raise awareness about bottom trawling. I'm always surprised to discover how many people have never heard of bottom trawling because it happens out of sight, out of mind in the ocean. So please, if any of this has aroused your frustrations and your anger, share that with other people. And let's get this talked about as much as if we were raising our favorite forests, flattening them out. We can also avoid eating from a bottom trawl. We can ask questions about how our seafood is sourced. We can ask from the merchants and the restaurateurs. And at first they won't know, but eventually servers will find out, chefs will ask questions, the salesperson in your fishmonger will want to know more. And at that point, we're moving. You might also ask whether your fish you're buying was from an aquaculture facility using bottom trawled feed. Use your vote, of course. Insist that government actually takes action on this egregious practice. I was interested to hear Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, starting to talk about some of these offensive bottom fishing practices the other day. Also, lever off that and ask government and industry to take action to move towards these sustainable fishing practices. So one strong way we can do this is by reducing the trawled area. So in fact, many coastal nations have rules and regulations that ban trawling from inshore areas within say 3, 5, 15 kilometers of the coast. So those rules need to be implemented. They're not just token, they're meaningful and need to be made effective. Of course, we've got to get bottom trawling out of marine protected areas. I just find it ridiculous that you would call an area protected and allow bottom trawling. The UK does just that. Oh, other countries too, including my own of Canada. Now the UK is proposing a new category of protected areas called highly protected. And that is extraordinary to me. That's where they'll actually ban bottom trawling, but continue to allow it in protected areas? No. All protected areas need to ban bottom trawling. At the moment, the world has arrived at a target of 2020 of about 10% of the ocean protected. But the next push until 2030 is going to be to get 30% of the ocean protected, as is about to be agreed under those global biodiversity targets. As we grow to that 30%, we should be particularly trying to get into areas where bottom trawling is conducted as a way of reducing that practice as quickly as possible. So let's make that 30% by 2030 actually count. And of course, no way should we allow expansion of bottom trawling, particularly into, for example, the deeper ocean, the high seas. But as well as reducing the trawled area, we need to make it much more difficult to trawl. So again, there are lots of rules and regulations that can be implemented and support the ambition of ending bottom trawling. For one thing, we should end harmful subsidies. And the World Trade Organization is negotiating that right now. So they're edging closer to an agreement that would actually end fisheries subsidies. The negotiations are going to come to a peak in late November 2021, so next month. before this month, before the World Trade Organization's 12th Ministerial Conference. And we need to make certain subsidies do end. We also, of course, need to deal with the human rights violations of slavery and indentured labor and coercion. And many such policies already exist. It's vital that we implement them in the fishing industry as elsewhere. And that raises the question, of course, of if we're to end bottom trawling, what happens to small-scale fishers? The answer has to be that, or what happens to people working on the trawl boats? Now, we've done some research on this, and what we're finding is that many people who are actively engaged in trawling actually don't have a history of working in fisheries, do not have an affinity for coastal livelihoods, but have been drawn into trawling because they need a livelihood and they're acting as hired labor, wage labor. Still, of course, there's the question of what to do with people who are working on bottom trawlers if we phase out bottom trawling, or as we phase out bottom trawling. And the answer is that we have to treat it seriously as we would people who work on road building, or people who work in industry, or people who work in manufacturing. How do we ensure fair and just employment? But it does mean that bottom trawling is not distinct. It doesn't need a special cultural attention as we address this challenge. We also, of course, need to meet our international promises, some of which I've outlined in this talk. So I'm inviting you to be part of the solution. Talk about bottom trawling and engage people in finding the solutions. Many of them are just a matter of implementing existing agreements with full commitment to reconciling fisheries and conservation. It's a challenge we can meet. We need sustainable fisheries just as we need healthy oceans. Thank you so much.